Hey folks, David Molnar here. Welcome back to the free video series on Aperture. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about some recommended apertures so that you have a starting place for if you're in a specific situation, you kind of have a go-to aperture to at least start at and see if that's the right fit for you. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about are portraits, okay? So if you're shooting a single person, just one person, not two, if you're shooting one person, like let's say a senior portrait, or you're shooting a model, or whatever it is, one of your kids, it is okay to shoot at a narrow depth of field. Now remember, depth of field is the amount of space that is in focus. It's not where is in focus, it's the amount, it's the distance that's in focus. So if my eyes are in focus and my nose is out of focus, that is a very narrow or shallow depth of field. And what I am saying is that it is okay to shoot at a very shallow depth of field when you're shooting a portrait of a single person, so long as the eyes are in focus, okay? And so here's one of the things you wanna look for. Ideally, you want both eyes of a person to be in focus, okay? But some of you guys like to live super dangerously and shoot at like aperture f1.8 or 1.4 or even 1.2 if you have a lens that can handle it. And there's some controversy here, but I think as long as your front eye of your subject or your subject's front eye is in focus, then you're okay. The nose could be out of focus, the ears could be out of focus, and that's okay to me as long as the front eye. So what I mean by that is, let's say your subject is turned slightly to the side. If you focus on this back eye that's further away from the camera and this front eye is blurred, then that does not look like a good portrait to me, in my opinion. I think a lot of people would know something's off, whether they knew technically why it was wrong or not. I think your subject is gonna look awkward, okay? So what you want to do in that situation is make sure and focus on the front eye, whatever eye is closest. Now, if you're straight on with your subject, both eyes should be in focus. If you're like this, at least focus on that front eye so that that one is in focus, and that will actually make the back eye more in focus than as if you had focused on the back eye. So, all that to say, it is okay to shoot at f1.8, 2.0, and 2.8 when you have one subject. If you have two subjects and you're shooting at, let's say, f2.0, okay? Just a little recap on depth of field again. If you are shooting at a very large size hole, which is a small number, like 2.0, that's a large size hole for aperture, right? That will create a very narrow depth of field. And like we're saying, it's okay to shoot at a narrow depth of field when you're shooting one person or one subject. So a good starting place is probably 2.8 if you're shooting one person. 2.8 is great, okay? Probably you're gonna have their nose in focus, probably you're gonna have their ears in focus, and their eyes should be both in focus, so that should be a great thing. You can live a little dangerously and you can go down to 2.0 or 1.4 or even 1.2 potentially. It just might be hard to get really sharp focus if you're shooting at 1.2, 1.4, or even possibly 2.0. So 2.8 is a really great starting place when you're shooting one person. When you are shooting two people, okay, and if you're shooting at 2.8 or 2.0, there's a really good chance that one of the two people's eyes will be out of focus, especially if you have two people that are not exactly in line. Now, if they're in the same plane, the same distance away from you, if their eyes for subject A and B are the same distance away, then at 2.8, you're probably okay. But to be safe, I'd really like for you to start at about f4.0 or 5.6, because the larger that number, the smaller you're making that hole, and the deeper, the smaller aperture size hole, right? And the deeper depth of field. So it gives you a little bit more leeway when you have two subjects, and if they're not perfectly in line, this way, so they're not perfectly the same distance away from the camera. So a great starting place for two people is around f4.0, so it gives you a little bit more depth and so that you can make sure you get those eyes in focus, okay? Now there are situations where you wanna focus on, let's say the bride and the groom is kind of blurred in the background. That's fine. In that case, you're really only focusing on one subject. Okay, like if you're doing something artistic and the groom's back here, or it's behind and kissing her neck or something, that's okay to shoot at a narrow depth of field because you're not really worried about getting that second subject's eyes in focus, okay? But in general, if you're shooting at just a straight up beauty portrait of two people, let's say it's an engagement session, or it's a bride and groom, or even if it's just two kids, you wanna shoot at least 4.0, possibly 5.6 to make sure that both of their eyes are in focus. Now, if you have a larger group, let's say 8, 10 people, 15 people, 50 people, whatever, and you have multiple rows, like let's say you're shooting a family portrait or a family portrait at a wedding, and you have the grandparents up front, and then you have like some extended family members in the back, there's a good chance that the people in the front row are going to be more crisp and the people in the back row could be a little bit softer if you're shooting at 5.6. So in this scenario, when you have more people, let's say groups of 5, 6, 7, 8, or 10 or 20 people, if you have anything more than one row of people, you might want to start around f8 or f11, which is a smaller aperture. It's not like a pinhole, but it's more of a middle of the road aperture, but that's going to allow you to have an even deeper depth of field, or a moderately deep depth of field. And in that scenario, at around f8, f11, you should be able to get both rows of people in focus. Now, if you have like 3 or 4 rows, you may need to go to f16, something like that. That would be to make sure that everyone is tack sharp and in focus, okay? The last scenario that I want to talk about is if you're shooting a landscape or a seascape or a waterfall, okay, and you want to show movement through your image. If you have a tripod and you can lock your camera down and you want to have a long exposure, let's say a long shutter speed. Now I know this lesson is not about shutter speed, but we know by now that shutter speed is directly related to aperture and of course ISO as well. If you have a long duration of time, it's going to let a lot of light in. So what you need to do is you need to compensate by making a very small pinhole, which is around f16 or f22. And when you create that small pinhole, you're giving yourself some leeway to shoot for a longer duration of time, which is what is required if you want to show water moving through your image. If you're shooting a waterfall and you want that water to be that silky, like flowing water through your image, then you need to shoot at a long shutter speed or a long duration of time, which requires you to stop down and make a very small hole. So simply put, if you're shooting a landscape and you want everything in focus, that smaller hole is going to create more depth and more of your scene in focus, and it will also give you the leeway to be able to have flowing water or movement of the clouds or whatever it is in your shot so that you can shoot a 1 or 2 seconds depending on the lighting situation that you're in. All right, so let's recap that real quick. If you're shooting one person, 2.8, great starting place, f2.8. If you're shooting 2 or more people, f4.0 to 5.6 is a good starting place. If you're shooting a group of 8 people or 2 rows of people, let's start around f8 or f11. If you're shooting landscapes and you want to have a deep depth and you want to have the mountains in the background in focus and you want to have your foreground, the flowers in the foreground, or let's say you want a long shutter speed, you need to start around f16 or possibly even f22, so it gives you a little bit more leverage and leeway. But remember, you need a tripod if you're going to shoot for a long duration of time. We have more information about that in the shutter speed lessons, and we'll probably have links just below this video for that. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this lesson about recommended apertures and great starting places for you to go for go-to apertures in unique situations. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about how aperture directly affects the way that sun flare is displayed in your images. I'll see you there.